Monarchy was overthrown. They had one execution in 1647, where Charles I was overthrown by the Puritan Parliament, fought in the Civil War against the Parliament, lost the Civil War, and then lost his life. He's the only English king that was ever executed by his own people, at least by a certain group of his own people, the Puritans. England was then ruled by Oliver Cromwell until 1560. Cromwell was not a king, he was not anything, he was a commoner, and it's a real disruption in the whole series of the English dynasties. Today in the official list of English kings, Cromwell's name does not materialize anywhere, does not show up. He's considered an anomaly, illegitimate, and so forth. Considered by many Englishmen to be a total, just a total waste. Part of the problem is that his rule was very, as you hate to use the expression, very puritanical, but in the sense that there was not much joy during this period. The theaters were closed. Holiday celebrations were limited. People were not given a lot of social freedoms during this period. Very tight period. And as a result, when Cromwell died rather unexpectedly, rather early, his son, who was supposed to take over the continued administration, it was known simply as the Commonwealth, not a kingdom at the time, but it was also known as the, beyond that, it was a period where he was known as Lord High Protector of the land, not king. That the son was supposed to become the next protector, wanted nothing to do with it. And so the whole thing just sort of folded up. It had no focus, no goal, no reason. At least in the eyes of many historians. Now some historians will come along and suggest, oh God, everybody has missed this. And come up with some magical, mystical interpretation of how we should really look at history again and glorify Cromwell and do something different with it. That happens a lot. Every time you go, anybody gets a new PhD in history, comes up with some new damn shit asshole formula for the past. Anyway, don't worry about it. We all do it. So the next period from 1660 to basically 1689 is the restoration of the monarchy. The monarchy is returned. You now have the restoration under Charles II. He is brought back from exile in France, and this is a period in which people want to just forget about religion and the whole religious issue that led to the Civil War, and it does that. It's a much more, I would say, skeptical age, much more of a scientific age, much less emphasis on religion, and we have the birth of political parties to solve these stinging political issues. Political parties did not exist in England prior to 1660. So when the Restoration comes, we have political parties. Those that support the king and most of what the king stands for, his power and his prerogatives, are called basically the Tories. That's the new political party. Those that sort of represent the loyal opposition to the king and want more strength given to Parliament, more judgment, more issues, more mandates under parliamentary control, we call the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. to some degree, those parties are still with us. Today, the Whigs are the Liberal Party, which, by the way, happens to rule Britain currently. It's a long time since the Liberals have actually had an organized party to rule anything, and they currently do. It's a rare event. Mostly it's conservatives who are Tories versus Labour, British Labour, which is much more socialistic. And those are the two strongest parties in Britain. But somehow the Labour came back, the Liberal Party came back. And that is they are the descendants of the Whig Party. Now, how many have heard these parties, the Whigs and the Tories and all that stuff? Okay, so you've read enough to know what I'm talking about. Hopefully you do. I don't know what I'm talking about, but hopefully you do. Okay. So we have birth of religious parties. And the great weakness of the Restoration monarchy is that with the two remaining monarchs, that is with Charles II, followed by James II, there was they didn't always understand who supported them and how. Both of them came back from exile in France as first father and then son, and then you have a younger son in James III, who's going to come along here. Not born yet. But they're all going to be more or less either secret or openly raging Roman Catholics. Now, the history of England in the 17th century, and the reason we get into the Civil War, is the issue of religion. The issue of very staunch Puritan Protestant Calvinists who hated Roman Catholicism and were doing everything they could to stamp it out in the country, suddenly are faced after the Restoration with who? A whole revived Roman Catholic dynasty. And they weren't too subtle about it. And this is an incredible, this is why I say the Stuarts were so stupid, is because of anything, I mean, they should have kept this religious thing very, very quiet and not stirred up the pot. They just had a civil war. They probably lost over 100,000 people, dead, killed in this civil war. Some historians say more than that. It was a brutal nightmare. And yet, they're coming back and they've just raised this whole religious question again. But instead, what they have are political parties to solve the differences. But what the Stuarts managed to do, the last two Stuarts, in a period of less than 30 years, is to alienate the very political party which supports the monarchy's prerogatives. Which political party is that again?
The Tories.
The Tories. By appointing as members of their cabinet, appointing as their favorites, making sure that in Parliament, certain members of the Parliament that they support are not in fact Tories, but are many crypto or secret Catholics. Yeah, I mean, you can't believe a dumber move. The Whig Party was just thrilled with this because they could see that this king and his prerogatives don't have to be supported. He's managed to undermine it himself. Eventually, it all catches up with these monarchs when it's found out that the Stuarts secretly supported not just the return of Roman Catholicism to England as the official church. Now, what is the official church of England at the time? It still is.
Anglicanism, Church of England.
Church of England, which is a Protestant church, which is essentially Calvinist. Not as Puritan as the Puritans wanted to make it, not as Calvinist as they wanted to have it, but nonetheless, that's it. Who's the head of that church?
The king.
The king, not the Pope. There is no Pope here. Who is the religious head of the Church of England?
Bishop of Canterbury.
Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay. So you have that particular equation. When everyone found out, midway through the reign of Charles II, the first Restoration monarch, that he was not too secretly a Catholic, and that he supported Catholic initiatives, but he also supported the military and political aims of the man who had held him in exile, the man who had taken care of him throughout his exile, the greatest figure in European history at that time. And that is, yeah, absolutely, Louis XIV. Louis XIV was an absolute renegade. He stood for absolute monarchy. He stood for, his motto was that he is the most Catholic king, sometimes uses the most Christian king. He believed he ruled with, there was no parliament in France, didn't believe in having one. He only ever had one advisor at any given time in his cabinet. There is no cabinet. He rules France the way he wants to. And he's built a brand new edifice to support his absolute monarchy, and that is the great palace at Versailles. It's all a statement about Louis and who Louis is and so forth. He is the greatest monarch in Europe, just ask him. And everybody did. And he's considered the epitome of monarchs. Still to this day, this is called the age of Louis XIV. It's not called the age of Charles II or the glorious revolution of 1688. Anything British at all. It's all French. The language is French. Glorious language of the past. The language of diplomacy was French. All comes because of Louis XIV. Louis fought wars most of his life, and he was an ardent Catholic, and he's going to support the Catholic cause. And now he's definitely ingratiated with the throne of England through Charles II and James II. They're going to continue to try and do his bidding, including find ways of granting power in England to the French. And you have to remember that there is a real sore point here. The sore point is England and France fought a long 100 Years' War over issues of land that the English continued to own in France for a long period of time. And from 1350 to 1450, it fought a century over this, and finally the French prevailed, thanks to Joan of Arc, who sort of pops into history out of nowhere and saves the day. I mean, it really was just about that bizarre. So that long-running feud between the English and the French now comes to a head again, and there's something sensitive when people find out that their king, Charles II, or his heir, James II, are supporters of Louis XIV and Louis XIV's political goals. Okay, so that now causes a great furor. And the result is the attempt to say, okay, we have something going on here we've got to bring about change. Now, you don't just bring about change and hope for an explanation after you do it. The 18th century, late 17th and 18th century always had to have some kind of a legitimate cause, a reason, a declaration, something that we don't seem to care about today, but a real reason for why they were doing something. For instance, when they had the English Revolution and the English Civil War in the 1640s, 50s, they gave it strong explanations. You had actually books on by John Milton, other figures that wrote tremendous amount of theological treatises on why we are doing what we're doing. Very apocalyptic in a sense, but nonetheless justifying the revolution against the king. They believe you've got to have a reason. You cannot just do something. It doesn't have any meaning if you're just overthrowing a monarch. You've got to have some form of legitimacy. Okay. I mean, you do like to justify what you do in life, sometimes. You like to have it have a higher cause. A higher, something up there that gives it meaning, gives it sustenance. By the way, is that sheet being passed around? The roll sheet?
Yeah.
Everybody signed it? Needs to sign up on it?
You need to say.
Just.
Don't look at me.
No, I have to. You're related to him.
That's not my fault.
That's not my fault.
Wasn't even in the
Blaming
room.
you. Not your parents into this.
Jesus Christ, they blame me too.
We'll all run from class the day he wears a kilt. Would you sign that, please? Get it to me after class? No, print. Last name first. Thank you. Okay. Okay, but things have changed. People are not using religious arguments to create their higher causes, to justify a higher cause. When you have a revolution, you've got to have a higher cause. Otherwise, you're just causing trouble. You're not number two. You want to get beyond. You want to give some kind of credence, some kind of higher justification for some dumb piece of shit you're doing. It just makes sense that you want to make it feel better. Give yourself a better feeling about it. Like when you did something as a kid, and your parents said, okay, you've had it, I'm going to kick your ass. Well, then you come up with all the justifications why you did it. The only one you wouldn't use is that God made me do it, because that's not going to work.
Your sister made you do it, it would work.
Yeah. She's still getting it. Very good, all right. Yeah, these two are related, so look out. Don't get in the middle of it. What happened in the late 16th, early 17th, and then into the 18th century was something that has no relation to politics at all. But it later forms the justification that people are looking for to overthrow this monarchy. And that is the scientific revolution. Scientific revolution, and what goes with the scientific revolution, you may remember, the Enlightenment, which is a political aspect of the scientific revolution. I won't go into all this, but you had a number of scientists who began to disagree with the normal view of history, the normal view of science, that the Earth is the center of the universe. And their view was that the universe, and nobody really knew what the universe was at the time. We knew about the solar system somewhat. But they said, no, it's not. You had at least 4 different individuals. Copernicus, you had, who was Polish, Tycho Brahe, who was Danish, Galileo, Italian, who all said the universe does not revolve around the earth and the sun does not go around the earth. It's the earth that is marginalized here. Our solar system, or our universe, is heliocentric, meaning sun-centered. The earth, as well as the other planets, all go around the sun. Well, that was revolutionary. Nobody believed it. It was also heresy, because it defied the description that shows up in a lot of the language of the Bible. It also defied a lot of the science of the Greeks and the Romans, which since the Renaissance had been absolutely understood as holy and sacred as the Bible. And it also defied the church, because the church accepted basically the language of the Greeks and the Romans, of course accepted the Bible's language of how the universe works, and therefore they have to be wrong, and therefore they're all excommunicated, and they were, including Galileo. Finally, in the late 17th century, you have another astronomer, physicist, and that is Isaac Newton, Englishman, operating out of Oxford. And his view is the same thing. The universe is sun-centered, it's not earth-centered, and I can prove it. And he also discovers what he said were the laws that made it work that way. And he comes across with the laws of gravity, the law of gravity. His idea, basically, that God created the universe and then set the universe in motion through these laws. And it's a whole different thing than saying that God is making all this stuff work. It's that God has set in motion laws that make these things work. Indirect control. That's the new theory. Natural law is the bottom line here. So natural law becomes something rather sacred itself. In the late 17th, early 18th century, natural law. And therefore, out of natural law, if we can, and there's a great deal of euphoria about, my God, look what we have discovered in just this short amount of time. How the universe works. This is wonderful. But at the same time, natural law is a question of, well, if we can discover that in how the universe works, what are there natural laws that govern, that should govern, if we can find what they are, that should govern human conduct, that should rule how government should be brought about under natural law. Certain things that work. For instance, we operate under natural law here. In the United States, we do. We operate under an assumption of a kind of a natural law. We say, we talk about all men are created equal. Who says natural law? There's nothing about that in the Bible. Doesn't come from, it's not biblical. It is from the Enlightenment, the political answer to natural law. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, originally. Later in this country, pursuit of happiness. That's also out of the Enlightenment, natural law expressed in the political jargon. So the things that we have come up with that talk about certain political beliefs, certain kind of what I would say metaphysical application, a higher calling to political concepts, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all are created equal, and so forth, comes from the Enlightenment, which comes from the natural law of the scientific revolution. These are the things that should make a government great. Therefore, and here's the big one, kings, like the Stuarts, need to have some adjustment. Basically, the view had been for quite a while. You have one sort of interesting closet belief for centuries, and that's that kings rule by divine right. And the last king to really proclaim that and got himself in a lot of trouble was one of the first Stuart monarch, James I of England, who claimed to rule by divine right in the face of Parliament. Parliament said, screw you, asshole. You can't, you're not, I mean, there's nothing about you that's divine, you're an idiot. His response to that essentially was to have anybody disagree with him openly arrested without due process. And so they strapped a couple of bills on it. The first application of a Bill of Rights that the people had, as opposed to this particular king. Well, he's the first of the Stuarts. Now we're dealing with the last of the Stuarts, and they're faced with what? That kings were originally endowed with the right to rule. When did this happen? under the concept of natural law, it happened way back when, in the state of nature, humans chose to have kings rule over them to do what? To maintain order out of chaos. That's why kings came about in the first place. I'm not saying that's why kings came about, but that's what they're saying under natural law. So this natural law becomes the formula for everything. The next thing is that kings felt the people's response to what the kings did was to simply obey the king, period. There is no alternative. You obey the king. King's right, king's king. He rules, you listen, you obey. But then some discussion came about on that, after the English Civil War, and others began to ask, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. What if the king is a creep like James I and like Charles I? What if they're like those guys? Well, then maybe we should work something out. They didn't know what, but natural law gives them an ability, gives them a justification for changing this stuff. The king has certain, under natural law, way back when, from the very beginning, we just haven't practiced it, but certain obligation. The king has to, there's qualifications on him. He has to rule wisely, justly, and fairly. He can't be a jerk, he can't be a total idiot, he can't reign arbitrarily. He can't arrest without warrant. He can't simply arbitrarily have people's ears cut off because they disagree with it, which these kings have been doing. Well, who says? Natural law says. Man, way back in the state of nature. That's when this came about. It's a two-sided coin. King rules, people obey, but on the other side, king has certain things placed on him, certain responsibilities. He must rule wisely, justly, and fairly. He cannot be an arbitrary schmuck. That's very important. The king's not. Go past their province. Okay, so the responsibility on the king. Nobody ever said that before. Nobody could tell that to Henry VIII, I'll tell you. If you look back at the difference, I mean, Henry VIII, I mean, he didn't give a shit what anybody thought about anything. He really, I mean, he just really didn't. He was not worried about natural law, trust me. He was only worried about the natural law that would eventually give him a woman that gives him a son. What can I say? We love Henry. I love him. He's great. He's great. Okay. He's a total idiot. I mean, he's just totally bad in every way. My kind of king. All right. Come on. I mean, don't you admit we got presidents?
Yeah.
Aren't they bad?
Yeah.
Most of the time.
Clowns in suits.
I don't care. Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever. I mean, God, just give me a king. Why have elections? Why screw around? Now you know I'm fooling around today, right? Just trying to work my way out of this. Feel awful. But I felt worse last week. I had all these ideas and no one to talk to. God. No, so I mean, I think about, England still has a king, and I'm looking, and people over there talk about they want to get rid of the king, they want to get rid of the monarchy, and I said, so you can become another schlock republic.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the republics we have today, all over the place. They're really, they're really crap. They're bad. It's not great government. Mostly corrupt, you know. We can't get anything done in this country, we know that. We've been trying what, for maybe 20 years to get something done. Hasn't happened. Anyway, all right. I'll be dead before it does happen, but it's okay, because it won't be significant anyway. Okay, now, so you had this new view of natural law in the Enlightenment, which is the political expression of natural law. Now, the English people, now members of Parliament, have a justifiable reason of getting rid of the Stuart monarchy. They have violated their contract under natural law, meaning they have not been ruling wisely, justly, fairly.
So this is a turning point, a big turning point in English history. In 1688, using this particular concept, this thesis, that was in development by one of the great political philosophers of the time, and that's John Locke, L-O-C-K-E. Locke was the great, I'd say the great promoter of the concept of natural law in England, the promoter of Enlightenment in England, the promoter of what was called the social contract theory. Social contract. King has an obligation, people have an obligation to obey, king has an obligation to what? To rule, but to rule wisely, justly, fair. That's the basic mandate. Did people take this seriously? They did take it seriously. The question is, how many of them really understood, even knew what Locke said, and furthermore, even really understood it? I don't know. Maybe less than half of those in Parliament really understood it. But one thing they did understood and later justified using these ideas was to get rid of this king. The last English king of the Stuart monarchy that had come on the throne with the sole mandate to rule as well as reign, the last one was James II. And when he baptized, had his own son baptized, not Church of England, Anglican Church, of which he was the head, but had him baptized a Roman Catholic, everybody said this is an affront that's just too damn much.
James II.
James II had his little son, James III, baptized Roman Catholic, and people said, enough is enough. And they have what's known as the Bloodless or Glorious Revolution of 1688. The army didn't support him, Parliament didn't support him. He has to flee the country. There's an army that's invading, and the army is led by the sister of James II, Mary, his younger sister, who was a Protestant, Anglican, and married to William of Holland. William was not king of Holland, he was called the stadtholder. Am I losing any of you in this discussion? Stadtholder, S-T-A-T-H-O-L-D-E-R, simply means the holder of the state. They didn't have kings in Holland. He's a Protestant, he's a Calvinist, he's married to Mary, and he now brings his army across with no opposition from anywhere in England. He marches directly into London, and James II flees the country with his little son. Where does he go? France. Where does everybody go?
France.
No matter how rotten you are, where do you go? You can always go there. You can always go. Maybe it's catching up with them. Their wine is no good anymore. All right, now they flee. And the new king, William and Mary, the new kings, William and Mary, have come with a new mandate, and that is to reign, but not to rule. Parliament's going to run the country. The reigning part, the symbol of the executive, is going to be the monarchy. But it's a new kind of monarchy. From this point on, you'll never ever have again any official English monarchy that claims to really rule the country. Now you will have monarchs that will try to do that. George III is going to try to do it. Queen Victoria is going to try to do it. But most are not. Most are content to be figureheads and not worry about it. The salary's good. Why worry? Yes.
But didn't the Tories still want the king's prerogatives?
They're going to always support the king in questions. There's various questions, yeah, and you're right. They're going to support it, but they can't change the fundamental structure now. This thing shifts. It's a seismic shift. So the period now that we're entering into is a whole new epic. It is based on natural law. It's based, and I challenge you to think about this question. I think we discussed it in the hallway one day after class. Whether or not natural law really exists in the form of human government. Because we have put so much stake in the concept of natural law, we think that fundamentally, good government will create good people. And the bad government creates bad people. And that a government that's abusive should be corrected by a government that's beneficial and so forth, and that all of our institutions should encourage, I think naturally, the betterment of human growth, human development. And when I was growing up, as an example, I remember hearing, you hear these all the time, that, you know, the disadvantaged need to have better advantages, and therefore, once they have those advantages, it'll improve them, improve society, and so forth. And that's just gonna work out just ducky. And therefore, for instance, juvenile law was there to rehabilitate, not to punish. And LA County, in fact, tons of counties across the country, have their entire probation systems developed around that idea, that we are going to rehabilitate. Folks, I was in that for 11 years. We never really rehabilitated fucking anybody, including me, as you know. But seriously, it was the most bizarre thing. But we pour billions into that system every year based on that idea that somehow is workable. To me, that is well, I'm not gonna argue with it. It's just that the question is there such a thing as natural law in regards to how humans act or interact? What do you think? Do you think there really is? Is there something metaphysical out there that we can apply? He's gonna step forward and let us know. Yeah, Thorndyke.
No, I think there's a concept where like people have self-interests, and often like people have stuff that's, you know, orderly, maintained, where people will all benefit, like, you know, safe drinking water, everyone likes that. That can actually you're be able to like have a spontaneous order emerge from that to help preserve
Right.
that interest.
Well, a lot of our social programs are designed to do that, to support. But a lot of things go wrong with that system. I'm not gonna go into it, but I just sort of look at this thing as, I was telling Chad, a lot like Plato's universals. It's a great theory, but do universals exist? And does natural law exist in relation to human government? I don't know. We're not going to discuss your child.
I'm not.
Okay.
I think the problem with the whole natural law entity is that we have a lot of people that don't think outside the box, meaning that they can't think beyond what they see, hear, feel, taste, whatever. And so I think it's foolish personally for us to think that we are the only people in the entire galaxy or whatever is out there, that we're just right here on this small tiny little planet of Earth being silly with all the bullshit. And so therefore we look for something to explain the reasoning that we think we understand that we don't. Does that make sense? So natural
Ancient
law,
aliens would love you.
yeah, natural law is the only thing that we can think of to make sense of
All right.
the
Let the
disorder.
aliens save our civilization. Good luck. Yes.
I want to say, well, if the concept of natural law is based upon trying to, well, like from the scientific revolution, it's trying to establish a mean from which to base ourselves.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know how we can
Yeah.
quantify that. There really isn't anything that we can go back to and say this is really.
Yeah.
I mean, we have human behavior.
150 years later, the Americans said the same thing.
Yeah.
All of our founding fathers were men very, very well schooled in the Enlightenment.
most of them, not all of them, were Masons as well. That were really, really tied to the concepts of the Enlightenment. And when they drew up the Declaration of Independence, they based it on the Enlightenment, they based it on the English Revolution of 1688. What was the statement?
The lock is all through
Yeah.
it's through it.
They draw up some 23 reasons where George III has violated his contract. Therefore, we have the right, under natural law, to remove George and replace him with somebody else or something else altogether. That's what they did in 1688. So people bought into this heavily. And our Constitution is heavily involved in it. The Declaration of Independence is an absolute masterpiece based on this. And it's worth thinking about. I mean, fine, whether it's right or wrong, we did it. I mean, whether these metaphysical aspects to it are true or not, the fact is, in the human condition, we have the right. We're making these choices, we're making these assumptions, we're making certain things happen based on it. Whether the stuff is real or not is not the question. The question is, we believe it's real, and therefore we're making it work under those assumptions. So, and then I'll get your question too.
Let's say, maybe we're thinking of natural law more in a singular sense. Maybe there's multiple natural laws that we
Sure.
So,
Here, not just one law. There's a lot. Just keep working. There's a lot of them out there. We don't want to inhibit anybody.
The thing about natural law that just strikes me is that they're hearkening back to a time before when man was in a state of nature,
Right.
when we don't even know what that means.
Of course.
They're just
Yeah, but that gives you freedom of action. If you don't know what's back there, and it sounds a little better than once upon a time.
You can make whatever
exactly.
you want.
But it's great, because you don't have to worry about anthropologists. They're not going to challenge you. They're not around. And historians are not going to challenge you, because they don't really deal with that way back stuff. You may fight with a theologian on some issue, but basically it's wide open. It's just out there. This is what I love about the early natural sciences and the early social sciences, is that nobody knows. So the sky's the limit.
And
Really?
since they can, it's just more, it sounds better with a longer history behind
It does.
something.
It sounds like you know what you're doing. It justifies the revolution. It justifies 1688. It justifies 1776. And everybody, as I get back to the original point, everybody was out to justify. They weren't just having a revolt. They weren't just having a bad day in politics. They were this was a severely bad time. And these were the main issues, and therefore they had to be explained, and they had to justify to the whole world. And that's probably what gave our Declaration of Independence enough clout, ultimately, to drag in half of Europe to fight our war against the British. We eventually hustled in the French, we hustled in the Dutch, the Swedes got involved. Everybody got involved in this war. Because everybody, of course, hated the English anyway.
But just give them an excuse.
But this is, oh God, thank you God for this war. We got to kill the English. So anyway, I mean, after all, nobody likes them. We had one guy here last year, remember our little English student?
Oh,
In
yeah.
class, he's a nice kid.
Nice guy.
He was an idea. I used to razz him a lot, but he was a lot of fun.
And you let him set the curve on the last exam.
Say what?
You let him set the curve on the last exam.
I did, because he knows his stuff.
Yeah,
He screwed you up, didn't he?
totally. Totally did.
Yeah, see, no mercy here.
Well, it's natural.
Oh, yeah, under natural law. No, I don't know, he did pretty well. He did pretty well. Actually, there was somebody else that did better than he did, but I can't remember who it was.
I do.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, I'm not gonna tell you, I'm not gonna ask you. So with that change, William and Mary, we now have England sort of beginning to look outside itself, but you have some real political structural changes take place in the country, where you have what would amount to, our today would call it electoral districts set up throughout the country, counties, that had so many representatives to go to Parliament, and those people would stand for elections to go to Parliament. And this is the beginning of that kind of parliamentary selection. And the question is, well, how many people had the right to vote? Voting, nonetheless, was nothing like anything universal at all. Today in England, it's anybody over 18 has the right to vote. It's universal, male, female, all together. There are no property qualifications at all. But at that time, it was very, very limited, based on some of your ancestry, based on how much property you actually owned. You had to have a certain amount of property. Presuming that people of property were people of learning, people who could read and write. That wasn't always true, of course, but nonetheless, they based it on that assumption. And so 1 out of every 350 people had the right to vote. Now, isn't that a wow? I mean, that's the great mother of parliaments is based on that those electoral properties. 1 in every 350 has the right to vote. That's not going to change until the Reform Bill of 1830, 1832. A lot later. Yes?
Oh, that was my question, you
Yeah.
answered it.
It's going to change in 1832. My favorite pub in London was called the Calthorpe Arms, and that's where that Reform Bill was born in 1832, the Calthorpe riots, protesting people's inability to have the right to vote. Then it spread into the factories and so forth. I used to really enjoy going down there, but they didn't know anything about this. It was a great pub, though. People could bring your dogs, and they'd sit there and drink, and just Guinness, mostly. That's all you need, about 8 or 10 of those. Those are the days. So you had a king, you had a parliament, you had 2 political parties now. And there was a great celebration of William and Mary. In the American colonies, a brand new university was named after them. William and Mary University, chartered through their benefits and so forth, becomes one of the premier universities, and still is, of this country. You had a sense of great deal of euphoria in the country at the time. And to most Englishmen, I am not saying in great depth, but to some depth anyway, they looked at themselves as being very far ahead of anything on the continent. The French, Austrians, the Prussians, any of the German states, Spain, Portugal, any of those countries, very much ahead because of this political process. Now they are ahead a bit, there's no question about it. And the fact is that Parliament, who now votes to support the king's prerogatives or votes to support their own prerogatives, are nonetheless obligated to support the king in some very tangible way. England becomes the first country in which the crown itself has access, has ability to reach the resources of the country, the vast capital resources of the country, by its ability to tap into Parliament, control Parliament, or at least work with Parliament. No other country had Parliament like this. And England was ahead by this time of just about everybody else, in the sense that most of the members of Parliament were involved, some were involved still as farmers and owned estates, but many are involved in business. What kind of business? The business of the age. Banking, exploration, colonization, trade. These are great money makers that have evolved over the last few centuries prior to this that really gives England an edge here. Even Louis XIV in France could not tap into anything. He didn't have a parliament. He didn't have people that were involved in overseas capital investment. He couldn't get them to do it. He didn't have bankers in the country. very few, did any of this stuff. But the English had the ability to tap into the new wealth of the age of exploration. France couldn't do it. Give you one short example of why that's so, what the difference is. In terms of overseas colonization, by 1770, the English settlement in the Americas, the coasts, the 13 colonies, had 3 million people. 3 million people. It was expanding, it was growing, it was commercial, vast trade connected with England and so forth. France, in the same period of time, functioning under their antiquated system, had an overseas colony in the same location in the New World, East Coast, 50,000. What's the difference here? A difference in attitude, the difference in freedom of investment in terms of freedom of exploration and trade. Definitely a different, whole different. I won't go into how that happened, that's a whole other story. So the kings of England could tap into, the rulers of England could tap into vast amounts of money at any given time, use that money to raise an armed force, to raise a navy, to preserve the one thing that was important to them, to preserve the military balance of power in Europe. England kept the philosophy as it had had for 200 years since Henry VIII, and that philosophy was this. England alone is too small to go to war with any country in Europe. But we will go to war against any country that tries to take over European hegemony. We will side with any power that stands against them to preserve the balance of power. We will give to that country, fighting to preserve the balance of power, the money they need, all the naval support they'll need, and additional whatever military support we can raise. But we will fight. And England will do that for the next 2 centuries. That's what World War II was all about, folks. That's what World War I was all about. That's what the Napoleonic Wars were all about. The balance of power. And this money, close to the throne, would allow England to function in a way that no other European country could. Any questions?
So,
Not you.
when members of Parliament had,
I'm sorry, say it again.
when the members of Parliament had all this money, how did the king use it? How did he?
Wisely, justly, and fairly. He'd remember that he better keep his act together.
And he couldn't just like seize their possessions. So
No, he couldn't do
just
this.
ask them for it.
Henry VIII could,
I know.
but
Oh, these guys
not
could.
current kings.
So would he just ask members of Parliament to support him?
If they do, usually it's gotta be a good cause before they would. Now, it depends. If you have, for instance, in the 19th century, mid-19th century, you had one member who had been a parliamentarian, who was now a member of the cabinet. He became England's foreign secretary, and then the English prime minister, and that's Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli absolutely loved Queen Victoria. I mean, he wasn't in love with her, but he adored her. He adored who she was, and she loved him because of that support. There's nothing that Queen Victoria wouldn't ask that Benjamin Disraeli would not try to get done for her. Acquisition of territory, property, and so forth. And he's the one that ultimately made her Empress of India. Now, she was already theoretically the crown of India, going back to the middle 1700s. But he's going to make it official. She wanted that title, but she never would ask for it. But he could make sure she gets it, and make sure Parliament supports this idea, and they're thrilled to do it. It's an imperial, not just a kingdom, but it's an imperial power. Others, the liberals, in government were dead set against this. This is bullshit. What are we doing this for? So he gives her added momentum, added prestige to her throne. And she gets her way on just about everything she wants as long as Israel's prime minister. So she uses her charms with him. And she's a widow, and everybody, you know, her poor defenseless widow, give the queen what she wants. And they did. She'd been widowed very early in life. Prince Albert died. So, and Disraeli saw that, he milked that. Nothing stupid, this is a pretty bright guy. I mean, so this is the kind of thing. It's not ordinary. It's out of the ordinary that this would happen, but it does happen.
So what was the ordinary way in which kings would get money raised?
They make the request through their ministers and to Parliament, and usually they had enough brains to know that this is not going to go. They wouldn't push it. Parliament would vote on it. And typically you have in Parliament, if you have a Whig majority, you're probably not going to get it. If you have a Tory majority, you might get it, but one part of the Parliament that's always going to vote on your side. Parliament's divided into two houses, House of Commons, which is the elected side, and the House of Lords, which is the inherited side. House of Lords had a vote. They don't have a vote anymore. But at the time, they had a vote, and they will always vote to support whatever the monarch requests. So that becomes the bicameral legislature, with one side always supporting the monarch. Take care, see you later. Always supporting the monarch will support this. And if you have a Tory majority on the common side, it's going to give you the way to go. There's a lot of screwy ideas that monarchs tried to pull off in the 19th century, but not all of them were able to do it.
So, who had more power, the House of Commons or the House of Lords?
House of Lords theoretically probably had more power because they could veto anything that the House of Commons tried to pull across. Even if the House of Commons this evolves in this period. As the House of Commons begins to bring forward their elected officials based on that representation chosen by 1 out of 350. As that group solidifies towards a particular position on something, the House of Lords theoretically, and sometimes did, if they disagreed with it, would veto it. Doesn't matter how good the legislation was and everybody in the country wanted it. House of Lords could say no, and that would be the end of it. So they had power. Later, I mean, one of the things that happens after following World War I is the House of Lords does that once too often. And finally, the law changes and strips the House of Lords of its veto power. Yeah.
How did that happen? Because they could veto that law.
No, they couldn't veto this one. This is the one to get rid of it. And riots were already in the country. So you already had a huge public demonstration against the House of Lords. They felt this was a medieval fluke, shouldn't be, let's get rid of it altogether. And the House of Lords knew if they continued to play around, there would not be a House of Lords around. So you have a choice. You can lose your veto or you can lose the House of Lords. They figured out, let's just lose the veto. Stay at home, drink brandy, and forget about it. Okay. Now, this coming century, the 1700s, is a huge century for the British. It's huge. It's going to move England, and after 1740, it's going to be known as Great Britain, the United Kingdom. It's going to move it into global power. It's a period that sees the growth of England as a phenomenon that's almost possible to explain. the victor in some 5 major wars. And ultimately, though it loses the 13 colonies at the end of the day in the 18th century, it's still going to emerge as probably the strongest nation on the globe, small though it was. In those wars, number one was the war against, first war against Louis XIV, the War of the Spanish Succession. Basically 1700 to 1714, War of the Spanish Succession. And I'll go over each of these next time. The second war, being known as Queen Anne's War, sometimes known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. (1740) 1749. Third war. This becomes a global war now. This is the War of the Austrian Succession, also known as the 7 Years' War, and in the American colonies it's known as the 9 Years' War because it started in the colonies, but it spread to Europe and Asia as well. Sometimes called the Great War for Empire. 1754 to 1763. It ended with the Treaty of Paris. Fourth war. The War of American Independence. By that time, everybody in Europe wanted to get even with the British and get their colonies back. They had lost to the British in the first 3 wars. And so they joined the very infant colonies, very infant United States, in a war against the British. So it began in April of 1775 and would end with the Treaty of 1783. Again, lasting quite a long time. Last war of the 18th century, but it'll continue on into the 19th, early 19th, was the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon. These wars were epic, fought globally, fought in the Caribbean, fought in the Americas, the Caribbean, fought in Canada, fought in Europe, fought in the Mediterranean, Middle East, India, and in the Indian Ocean. Global conflict. That war will not end, last for 23 years, and will not end until 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. So you have all these wars going. Out of this, England emerges as the greatest country, largest colonies on earth, a global empire with the largest navy. England's navy at this point reached a period based on philosophy that it had given it victory all the time throughout all these 5 wars, and the new philosophy was the British Navy will always be twice as large as the next 2 navies combined. Good philosophy, you can keep up the work. And this is now entering the period of, following that, entering the period of the British Empire. Now for this class we're using 2 books, The English Heritage, which is a basic political diplomatic study of the country, which is a good little book, volume 2 after 1700. And then we're using The British Empire, Sunrise to Sunset by Philippa Levine, who's a colleague of mine at USC some time ago. And this book just came out 2 years ago. It's based on good research. I think it's well written, so enjoy it. That's it, and I'll see you on what? Wednesday.